So good evening. My name is Gary Painter, and I'm the director of the Price Center for Social Innovation. We're really excited to have you here today to have an important discussion and to discuss the work of Dr. Rucker Johnson's book, Children of the Dream. And we're excited to have that. We'll have an opportunity for me to facilitate a conversation and also to have questions from the audience as we go through the evening. At the Center for Social Innovation, our mission is to develop ideas and illuminate strategies to improve the quality of life for people living in low-income urban communities. And we fulfill that mission through research, education, and convenings like tonight, where we can engage with people in the community, people in our community, both on the academic side and people who are out there doing the work themselves, who care deeply about these issues that we face. Tonight we have a real privilege of having Dr. Rucker Johnson join us for an important discussion on the success of school integration. Just a little bit about Dr. Johnson. He's the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy in the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's also a faculty research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He was trained as a labor economist and who specializes also in the economics of education, and his work broadly considers the role of poverty and inequality in affecting life chances for families and for young adults. These issues are central to part of our mission in the Price Center. One of the key foci of what we do is to address issues of how do you close the achievement gap that exists by race and class in educational outcomes. And so I'm especially excited to have Dr. Johnson here with us tonight. I encourage you to engage with tonight's conversation through social media using the hashtag #SchoolIntegration and/or, if you want, Children of the Dream. You can tag us at USC Price CSI. And before we get started, I thought it would be useful to put some context, maybe read the first paragraph of the introduction, which I found really apropos to a conversation in the Center for Social Innovation. It reads as follows: more than 60 years ago, the federal government embarked on an experiment of astonishing ambition. It decided to reverse centuries of racism, discrimination, and forced separation of the races. The laboratory where this experiment took place is where we frequently test our grandest ideas about what American society should be: the public school classroom. The experiment was called school integration. And with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Johnson to join me in this conversation tonight.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Great.
So I know not everyone has read the book yet, but hopefully after tonight's conversation, they'll run out and grab their own copy of the book so that they can get the details. But for people who haven't read it yet, can you tell us about the central thesis of the book and kind of your approach and your main findings?
Yeah, well, so Gary, I first want to thanks for the wonderful and gracious introduction. And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to join us in this conversation. I think that the mission of the book was for nights like this where we could engage on what is the way forward for ensuring the promise of equal education opportunity could be realized. That we've had a kind of series of failed social experiments, school reforms that have been kind of hit or miss, and what is lacking is the patience to actually follow through on some of the boldest reforms that the country has really pursued. And so we wanted to use data as a time machine to try to go back and try to extract the lessons of what, I tend to move about. But so we wanted to extract the lessons from what have been, if they have been failures, let's try to understand what caused them to not be successful. But if they've been successes, what are the things that we discontinued that we're actually working to close gaps? And one of the things that first comes out is that there's 3 major equal education opportunity policies that we pursued in this country. School desegregation, perhaps the most ambitious, but accompanied them were the school funding reforms of school finance litigation and legislation to try to lessen the ways in which property wealth and community wealth affects access to quality schools through the funding mechanism. That is another part of segregation. And so we were trying to look at the combination of school integration, school funding reform, but also preschool investments through Head Start, and look at their lasting significance in the opportunities and success for that children experienced. And one of the things about following children over a long time horizon is that you can really get at outcomes that are missed by short-run test scores, and that you can really look at the variation in which communities really were able to provide integrated environments, which environments were able to do things that narrowed school spending gaps between rich and poor communities, and which were able to invest early and sustain them. And one of the things that we found was there were just dramatic reductions in academic achievement gaps, in educational attainment, and the rates at which people were going to college. And we're talking about like a 40% decline in the black-white academic achievement gap that is really most pronounced among cohorts that were exposed to integrated schools. And the narrowing of the college attendance gaps were narrowed to the point that by the mid-'80s, the rates of black and white 18 and 19-year-olds had reached the same rates of college going as for blacks and whites. And what we document is that integration played the dominant role in that convergence, that unprecedented racial convergence in education, in earnings, and it even spilled over to affect adult health outcomes. And part of that is looking not narrowly or confining our understanding of what integration is by looking only at the assignment of school children. But to expand the definition and understanding of what integration really means is it's about school resources, it's about access to teacher quality, about teacher diversity, it's about reductions in class sizes. Those are kind of the elements that build for kind of an inclusive and equitable school system where diversity by design creates excellence across racial and ethnic groups where all children can learn and thrive. So what's clear is we didn't sustain those investments. What's clear is we didn't sustain that commitment. And we try to document where did we begin to retreat from those efforts, and then what would be the path forward to get back on the on-ramps of equity and excellence. And I think our schools, but most importantly our children, deserve that kind of focus. And so the book was really trying to lift up in an evidence-based way, but also in a way that engaged broad audiences to, we all have a stake in our country's future, and schools are playing the central role in whether that is a future that builds economic growth across communities or in ways that kind of continue polarization and stratification and inequality.
So some of what you said is kind of alluding to an answer to this next question, but it does seem that there's a narrative out there, and maybe completely false, but there might be some evidence in it that somehow school busing efforts and or school integration efforts failed. There was the promise of them, but it failed. How would you respond to folks that have confronted you, I'm sure, as you've gone around the country sharing this research, and say, no, I don't think it worked?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's the most popular misconception of both not just school integration, but also school spending doesn't matter, Head Start doesn't lead to lasting results, that there's a lot of fade out with regard to Head Start spending, that school desegregation was a failed social experiment, that it was really social engineering from the start, that it kind of led to even greater polarization. I think that one of the things that people miss is that we just celebrated the 60th anniversary of Brown v. Board, landmark. But if you look closely at the actual timeline of when significant integration efforts actually occurred, we're talking about a narrow 10 to 15-year window. And it's really looking at that window in which significant efforts happened, where if you look before and after, you see a striking contrast on outcomes. But if you're outside that window, it did not continue to succeed. Tracking and classrooms that became segregated in what otherwise would look like desegregated schools. Some of the implementation leading to black teachers being some of the first fired in integrated communities, there were some aspects of how integration was implemented that did not yield some of the results that could have if it was done in a holistic way. But in the communities that did, and we're able to have nationally representative evidence to be able to document that, we really see significant changes in the life trajectories of kids that were actually from the same communities, but before and after these opportunities expanded. So one of the things that people often say is integration failed. I think what we really need to say is segregation has failed. What we have much more in evidence base is the consequences of segregation. And what we have less historical documentation of is what the policy apparatus that is created the steps toward integration. Because even when we did integration, we were still in the early steps. That desegregation is the first step, and moving from desegregation to integration is moving from access to inclusion. It's moving from just exposure to understanding. And you have to kind of do that in a sustained way, and that involves teachers. Because teachers are coming in with their own biases, as we all do, and the question about how we create systems and a system-wide approach to tackling these issues is kind of what's lost. And so part of, I would say, the big data revolution is bringing empirical data that looks across the country, uses natural experiments where we did it in some places, we didn't do it in other places. The very fact that, you know, the presidential debates where we had Biden and Kamala Harris, and it brought, you know, new attention to the issue. But if you listen carefully, you can hear that the narrative has been hijacked. That instead of talking about integration, the conversation was about busing. Like, when was it, busing was a tool, but the whole effort wasn't really about student school assignment. Wasn't it about efforts to create equitable opportunities? And so I think the revisionist history of the challenge of integration was real. It did leave scar tissue in Black communities that experienced a lot of resistance. The white resistance was real. The delay in actual full implementation was long and elongated and confrontational. But I think among the communities that experienced it, when we go deep into Charlotte and places that experience these transformations, the children that were exposed left as adults different. And we tried to kind of lift up those stories alongside the quantitative evidence.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the word revisionist history. Some in the room have actually listened to a podcast titled Revisionist History by the person Malcolm Gladwell, who I call a pop sociologist. So I say that only for those other sociologists in the room that are not pop sociologists to appreciate that there is a clear distinction. However, he does a bit of revisionist history. He uplifted the fact that you mentioned earlier that maybe that the white teachers they brought their biases into the classroom, and that could be harmful for the kids that had moved from a segregated Black-only school to a integrated school. He noted that a lot of the Black teachers, and you'd mentioned this as well, maybe they didn't get retained in the integrated schools, maybe they were the first fired and so forth. His then premise at the end was actually those kids suffered because of integration, and clearly your evidence suggests otherwise. Are there things in his narrative that go beyond, and you've alluded to it a little bit, that you would point to that if this first step was done and then the second and third, your evidence suggests that really was powerful and long-lasting, whereas if the first step was taken and then there was specific resistance, then it could unravel those initial efforts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what's real is teacher diversity, the shortage of minority teachers in schools today, the shortage particularly in STEM fields and math and science. I think that's a real thing, and urban schools are experiencing the brunt of it more than others. So is that a real issue? Did the way in which integration was implemented in ways that had some racist underpinnings to not retain Black teachers and kind of not embrace a multicultural curriculum? Did those things happen? Yes, but I think that the benefits still were able to overcome even some of those challenges that weren't realized about the full dimensions of it. And I think part of this is a process. And one of the things that we tried to do was adjoin the quantitative evidence that give you kind of an aerial view, that give you a picture. And so Malcolm Gladwell is telling a story that's accurate about the loss of black teachers, in part that happened immediately following integration or desegregation plan implementation. My grandfather in West Virginia at the time was a casualty. They then moved to Minneapolis, and he was among the first fired in the integration efforts in Minneapolis. So I know that that story is real from a both personal experience as well in the extended family. But I would also be the first to say that the children that experience smaller class sizes, more college preparatory access, better per pupil spending, that a disproportionate share of the funding prior to integration was at the district level disproportionately distributed to the majority white schools. So like there was a 20% increase in school spending that black children experienced who were exposed to integrated schools relative to the same children from those schools, districts that were confined to segregated schools. So the per pupil spending is a big part of the mechanism through which the integration played a role in changing the opportunity structure. But yeah, so I think we wouldn't have known that, but we went back to the archival data, tried to understand that, and then we did the qualitative interviews with school leaders and superintendents and used the timing of the court orders to try to really look at which places, where it happened, and it gives us a really great, much more texture to what happens inside the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the most powerful findings that I took out, and others would probably find other findings that were, powerful for them, was the fact that you saw that when there were school finance reforms and integration efforts, that these efforts, while individually in places had positive impacts, when they were brought together, they actually had catalytic and multiplicative types of impacts. And certainly when we're thinking about complex problems, one of the things that we've, in the Center for Social Innovation, kind of have noticed in particular is that, our approach, and certainly our discipline, economics, which is kind of framed around thinking about one intervention, holding everything else constant, looking for the impact or the most cost-effective and those kinds of things, maybe aren't the only way forward. And actually, your evidence suggests a single intervention is the wrong way forward. You actually can get much more bang for your buck if you pair multiple interventions, all that are restricting access in all these different ways. And so, again, to me, I found that multiplicative finding of school finance reform, resources plus integration, really accelerated much more rapidly the trajectories for kids that had been in segregated schools.
Yeah, and that's really what a big thrust of the theme and through line of the book is really about. Not integration simply as a policy, but as the very approach to policy. When you look at a systems approach to inequality, you understand the housing has baked in inequality, the schools have baked in inequality, the access to health and health care. There's a lot of dimensions that open up to emerge the inequality that we see. So while we focus on the symptom often, we can't confuse the symptom, which is these achievement gaps, with the underlying root, which is the gaping educational opportunities that exist in children's lives that begin at the earliest years. So just the very fact that by third grade, half of the achievement gap that we observe among third graders, half of that existed at kindergarten entry, which really highlights the kind of big footprint that early life experiences have, which is why if we invest early in the preschool years, it then creates a set of children that are more school ready and can better take advantage of these learning opportunities that happen in the K-12 system. But similarly, there's socialization aspects of children that biases are not born with. We learn about these biases through the way that we structure exposures to diversity. When we begin early, we see that there's certain type of skills and that are easier to acquire at younger ages. Think about like even just language acquisition. That bilingual and immersion programs in language acquisition is easier in those early years. We see the same kind of dynamic in socialization processes and kind of building. And as you said, it's not an additive aspect of pre-K, but the long-term effects of pre-K investments are dependent on the quality of the subsequent investments in the K-12 years. And we find that the communities that had the preschool access, but subsequently most of those children actually attended poorly funded schools in the K-12 years. We do then see the fade out of those investments not lasting beyond the elementary school years, but that's not an indictment on the quality of the pre-K program, but rather the inextricable link that those investments have to be sustained. And so part of it is that it's not just additive, but in some ways it's almost exponential. That, you know, as economists, people in the macroeconomics community talk about multiplier effects and fiscal multiplier effects. Well, in child development, it's really developmental multiplier effects that when you can combine the pre-K investments with school resource equity in the K-12 years. But what's important is if you can also do that in integrated environments. What happens is the teacher diversity and the quality of teachers that you're able to retain, recruit, and develop become a much higher and more diverse set when they're not in concentrated poverty schools. That in concentrated poverty schools have the most difficult time retaining, developing, and recruiting diverse sets of teachers. So the teachers that are getting the biggest value added in terms of their improvements of test scores and improvements of social-emotional learning, those are actually the teachers that tend to sort out and get more burnt out in high poverty school environments. And that's the biggest resource that schools offer, is that person at the head of the classroom. So one of the missing ingredients of school resource equity is the teacher quality. And so that's how these things are kind of inextricably connected. And yet our typical approach to these matters is to treat school quality in terms of resources and the like, and school segregation or school diversity as kind of separable. And that we're making an argument that they're inextricably connected and you cannot make progress on the one without embracing aspects of the other in a kind of unified way to, you know, try to tackle these otherwise educational opportunity gaps. So that's, I think, a big part of what we're trying to put forth. And yet there aren't a lot of, we were trying to close the book like you would think of closing a book. Like if you think about closing a book, you think, you show people the problems, you show people some prescriptions for change, and then you should lift up like some prominent example of here's what the North Star looks like, here's what we all should be going for, and here's this district. So I traveled across the country on the lookout for such a city, for such a community that I could say, this is our model. And if you look in the back of the book, you don't see like such a close. And primarily it's because we don't have a model. We have models that no longer exist. We had a model in Charlotte, and then there was a release of a court order in 2001. And it returned schools to neighborhood schools. It led to significant resegregation. It's one of the reasons that Charlotte was ranked the lowest among cities in boosting upward mobility chances of poor kids. And now they're trying to turn that around. But my point is, we highlight Charlotte because they had become a model of integration. Anthony Fox became the first mayor, black mayor of Charlotte. He went on to become the first, as you know, Secretary of Transportation. I'm getting that right?
Yeah.
In the Obama administration, right? And so we got in-depth interviews with some of these, you know, important pioneers that could lend additional credence about what they attributed to their success. And time again, from the current president of the Ford Foundation, who was among the first to attend Head Start, to the, I mean, you would be surprised at people's life stories that schools played the, you know, catalyst role in that. Because I went to Morehouse for undergrad, I have to lift up one additional one.
Please
Robert
do.
Smith. You may know him as the billionaire who,
That's right.
at the last Morehouse graduation, paid all the college debt. If you talk to him, which we corresponded with him, he tells the story of how he was part of the early cohorts of Denver's integrated schools, and that was part of the transformative school experiences that helped shape his trajectory. So I think there's a lot of lost stories, there's a lot of policy amnesia, but what we realize is there's a lot of living history, and there's a lot of the evidence that we try to bring to bear to say, we do have some prescriptions for change, but it's going to require a mobilization and a multiracial coalition to be rebuilt to capture those imaginations.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you've identified is these multiple feedback loops, and in some sense, even markets that are operating at odds with each other at times, right? And one of your theses, as I understood in the book, is that somehow integration creates a way of aligning these potential feedback loops that sometimes have tear people apart. Instead, that somehow integration, maybe it's through a political economy channel, maybe it's through another channel, over time actually delivers on the dream, as is in the title.
And I think it's real that it's the road less traveled, and it's the road less traveled, especially the road less traveled recently. But I think there's also a reason, because it is the harder road. But it is the road, and only one actually, that offers healing and redemption and bringing communities that have been scarred by division back together. And so I think that the parents involved case, for example, there's a series of Supreme Court rulings in the early 90s that began to turn the tide away from court-ordered school desegregation and greater toward kind of neighborhood schools, really. They've released the court orders. It sprung a process of resegregating of schools that culminated in the parents involved case that involved Seattle and Louisville. And that ruling said that race could not be used as the sole indicator for student school assignment. And what's unfortunate about it is that it equated the use of race to combat racism integration with using race to further segregative aims. And it's a little bit of the logic of Prop 209 in the sense of not recognizing that race should not be the only way of using, but socioeconomic diversity along with race, I think, given the legacy of past discrimination, has to be considered. And so I think socioeconomic diversity and racial and ethnic diversity, I think, are equally important to kind of thinking about what it looks like in contemporary education context about what we should be looking for and what kind of models can do that.
In your work, I don't remember it being highlighted as much in the book, but maybe more in some of the papers that you've written that contributed to that knowledge base. Did you note how it affected students who were white or non-black in terms of their outcomes? Because I was thinking of an assignment that I gave to some of my economics students in the room tonight. We were looking at housing segregation, and there was an Urban Institute project in Chicago that actually found that both white and black students in integrated neighborhoods ended up going to college more. So it wasn't just black students.
Yeah, and what we find in general is that the school resource equity and school spending increases benefited all groups that experienced those increases. The preschool investments, if among low-income families, were similar for black and white children, and the only time they were less beneficial for blacks is when minority children were more disproportionately attending lower funded schools in the K-12 years. That explained why they weren't always achieving the same returns on some of those longer term effects. But I think one of the things I would say is that we don't find any evidence of kind of what people call a zero-sum game, that the benefits for African Americans came at the expense of whites. We see no evidence of that. And on outcomes that I think are reasonably important that get missed by the traditional economic markers and educational markers is just racial cohesion. We look at outcomes in adulthood on things like racial attitudes that can be mapped into indices of racial prejudice and indices of racial intolerance. And we also look at political attitudes in adulthood on issues of political polarization and whether equity is described as an important goal of public policy.
Okay.
And we find that children who were not exposed, particularly non-Hispanic white children who were not exposed to diverse school environments in the K-12 years, have significantly higher rates of racial intolerance, and the kind of political polarization that we witnessed is significantly tied to this resegregation that we're able to highlight through looking at current younger adults, but who were educated through the period of resegregation of schools. So we think in important ways that it's not just about the educational outcomes, but it's about the holistic set of outcomes that are produced through schools. I think one of the things that I would say, try to lift up so that people understand there's an investment approach and orientation toward this that has to be embraced is that these investments more than pay for themselves. So for example, let's just do a little bit of a quiz among this very highly intelligent group. Which states are the highest spenders in per pupil spending in the United States? So which states are the highest, ranked 1 and 2 in per pupil spending here in the US? Massachusetts, good, that's number 1. We already got a winner. Number 2?
Good job. No.
Not California. Connecticut's in the top 5, but not number 2. So Massachusetts and New Jersey are 1 and 2, okay? Now, New Jersey has one of the most progressive funding formulas through the Abbott rulings. We interviewed Judge Gary Stein and Judge Deborah Ports, who presided over those landmark rulings, to get a sense of what caused them to focus also on pre-K investments as part of the school funding formula, that they were the first state court-ordered system that combined K-12 progressive funding formulas with mandatory pre-K investments for low-income communities as well in their ruling. And we find that that played a significant role in the narrowing of their achievement gaps in comparison to Pennsylvania, next door neighbor, who have the same demographic profile but has among the most regressive funding systems. So we look at that. But the reason I mentioned both Massachusetts and New Jersey is because they pursue 2 out of the 3 of what we call the kind of 3-dimensional synergy of school integration, school funding reform, pre-K investments. They did 2 out of 3. They still have very segregated schools, but they have a progressive funding formula. They invest early in the pre-K years. They're number 1 and 2 in those things. But what they're last in is per pupil criminal justice expenditures. And there's a reason for that. So what we try to document is how the investments in K-12 and preschool create and avert future crime costs. That they not only invest in those kids, but they end up becoming much less dependent on public assistance and welfare dependency in adulthood. They significantly reduce the annual incidence of incarceration. They significantly reduce poverty rates. And so we really think that the best antidote to criminal involvement is not through the criminal justice system and policy levers, but it's actually through these early preventive investments in the K-12 years. And so we try to document that, and again, to highlight that even if you weren't overwhelmed and compelled by the moral imperative, which we think you should be, that from a pure equity standpoint, there's not even a trade-off between equity and efficiency in this context. It's just a matter of the time horizon that our political process is prioritizing short-run outcomes and what's politically expedient.
Yeah. Has anyone tweeted out yet, not a zero-sum game, or everyone wins, or equity and efficiency? You know, just the few hashtags are available for use tonight already.
Thank you for that gentle nudge, right?
Yeah, I think that it's such powerful evidence, and certainly yours is not the only evidence that has lifted this up.
True.
But, you know,
I think there's an explosion of new evidence on this.
Yeah.
And also evidence on the consequences of not intervening that have costs. So the idea that the investments have costs is not really clarifying that the lack of intervening has greater costs. So, you know, we often talk about opportunity costs. Well, there are opportunity costs of not
Inaction.
inaction.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to, mobilize a collective action around that. And part of the integration means that we're trying to integrate the stakeholders, the advocacy organizations, the school leaders, the community. We're talking about social innovation. That's what we're here for, the Center for Social Innovation. The spirit of that is to bring together the research community, the practitioner, and policy communities, that if they're integrated, if the pre-K environment is not siloed from the K-12, if the health and public health communities are not detached from the housing communities that govern a lot of the segregation issues, then we will have much more traction in doing the work in concert. Because a lot of that work is being done, but in separable and siloed ways that are undermining the collective impact that these synergies can create.
Yeah. So while you said that you didn't end the book with go to Duluth, Minnesota, and this is the place where it's happening, you've actually, in my view, given us a very simple yet complicated to enact policy formula of 3 key levers that actually have exponential or multiplicative effects, from pre-K investments to progressive funding formulas to integration as part of that portfolio of interventions to achieve the objectives of closing the achievement gap. Is there anything else you would like to leave us with in terms of, before we entertain questions, around ed reform or systems outside that can complement and complement that work?
Yeah, I think that there's probably some additional things, but I'm confident that this audience will cause it to happen more quickly and with greater energy. So let's open it up to the audience, and then I'll come back around if some of those issues don't come up naturally.
And so there will be microphones coming around, and please introduce yourself and any affiliation that you may want to represent this evening. So please, questions for Dr. Rucker Johnson tonight. Here in the front.
Thank you, Doctor. And I really appreciate you moderating this as well. I'm Khalid Alaleen, president of Park Mesa Heights Community Council, so it represents Hyde Park, Angeles Mesa, View Heights over here in the Crenshaw district. And one of my, I guess, activities as a volunteer in this is to find out strategically how can we prevent or create interventions to a lot of the research you have done in terms of how our schools have been disenfranchised, our communities as a whole disenfranchised. And so again, I appreciate the data, the evidence that you have presented, because it's like a blueprint. And the fact that you didn't give a North Star is all more to your credit, because we don't need something to be shown to us. We need to be able to develop that way forward. And I believe that if the community schools aspect versus privatization, if we have our own autonomy and we have a cultural relevant model as opposed to Common Core or what have you, I mean, that can be integrated. But the issue has always been, historically, you have communities who have been invaded, Black Wall Street, Fairfield Industrial, where these communities thrive just being Black. And now we're being gentrified and basically just marginalized through systems of oppression. What do you see as one of the primary goals to move communities of color, low-income communities, in terms of developing a pedagogy and a curriculum model to help start developing and intervening in areas of proficiency in English language arts and mathematics?
That's good. So that's a lot. You said a mouthful. So I will not pretend to do justice to all the issues you laid out. But I will say that I think a lot of leaders who are African American in education, like yourself but others, I do hear a lot that they're content with leading schools that are all Black, all Latino, and just give us the resources and give us the requisite support to be successful, because we can be successful. We're just not being given the adequate resource. And I think that general thought is also what some liberal whites also wanted to co-sign. Like, we don't really want our kids involved in that process of integration. So what we're willing to do is like, we'll give you some more money and let's just lift these court orders. Let's just go back to neighborhood schools. You do your own thing. We'll do our own thing. Let's just admit to go our separate ways because this doing it together is like, you know? So I think that that was a real thing. I think implicit bias on the part of teachers. I think the kind of not equitable, but also not kind of underestimating the potential of Black and minority and Latino children. Like, I think those things are real. I don't think they're even intentional. Like, I think in the older era, I do think it was explicit and a lot of racism. I think this is much more implicit bias in ways that are not even, it's definitely often not intentional, but I think it speaks to, should the minority Latino schools be the only ones that have a multicultural curriculum? Should I have to open up a charter school so that I'm confident that teachers are going to believe in my students' potential? Should I have to choose between my student having like confidence in their identity as a minority versus a school that's going to have smaller class size? Should that be the trade-off? Is that the decision that parents should be facing if they're minority? And is the student or the parents that are non-Hispanic white but value diversity, should they have to be choosing between like better resources or exposing their kids to more diverse settings? Or should there be a place and a movement that actually creates conditions where these things can coexist? Now, I'm not trying to be pipe dream. I'm very like optimistic and all those things, but I'm not unfamiliar with the terrain of challenge in this. I'm a product of educators. My mother's former superintendent of 3 major urban school districts. So I'm not like just somewhere in the statistics lost and not understanding some aspect of the challenges on the ground. I don't suggest that I know all the context that you know, but I guess I would just say there's a partnership that I think is necessary for leaders to cultivate. This is just a reminder, I was just at a convening with the Richard Carranza, the New York City Chancellor, and he's been trying to push forward on integration in New York City. And one of the things is he was trying to have teachers be exposed to an implicit bias training and other things to create a diverse teaching workforce, but also one that could teach a diverse set of students that and to try to kind of reimagine gifted and talented programs and replace them with school enrichment for all, instead of saying we're going to have Princeton for mine at the expense of everyone else, or that the public mission of education, that the public mission of public schools has been hijacked by the market metaphor. Like the market metaphor works for public education. Like that charter school movement is gonna enact this great innovation and best practices. Have we seen that? Okay, I'm just saying, can we name the Harlem Children's Zone? Yes. Can we name some successful Boston charter school success? Can we name some places that have, but surrounding all of those, it's a lot of innovation without evaluation. And it's a lot of things that are not really scalable solutions, where we still have basically, lotteries that are determining access to a student's future. Those are not recipes for holistic, scalable, and sustainable realities that we're aiming for. So I don't mean to say it has to be all Black or all Latino, like Harlem Children's Zone is an example. But what did it take? Where do you see like Wall Street and Goldman Sachs investing in the local communities? Is Jeffrey Canada an amazing leader? Yes. But I'm just saying there's not Jeffrey Canadas in so abundant supply that can lead the fundraising efforts to make that beyond aspirational. Like, it's not replicable in the same way that we're going for. So I think the question is like, not where are there pockets of, can it beat the odds? We're not trying to beat the odds, we're trying to change the odds. That's the question. Is the aspiration to just have a bunch of, like, we beat the odds? We have some people at USC right now, minority students, and they're lifted up because they beat the odds. We have some Asian American, we have some Hispanic, we have some low-income white students here, and we might say they beat the odds. What we're trying to is build systems that change the odds so that they're not dictated by the zip code, they're not dictated by, what neighborhood you grew up. And I think that requires like something bolder, something more imaginative. And I'm saying, let's start with the three things that we know work but are politically resisted. And let's get back to some of those basics and realize, polarization of political attitudes, racial hostility, racial ethnic intolerance, the rise of prejudice, that's connected directly to what commitment we're going to have through our school system of it being equitable, high quality, and beginning in the early years. I think this is the time where the problem window, the politics window, and the evidence window converges. And we embrace, this is our civil rights movement. This is our, war on poverty. This is our, so I think I'm not maybe the person that is saying free college for all, not because I don't think college quality and student loan debt, but I just believe that it's actually the lack of college readiness that's actually a larger component of the deficit than it is the debt in college. I think it's actually people going to college and 40% of them not getting a degree within 6 years. That is like not just financial, that is also college readiness, where the K-12 system and the pre-K-12 pipeline is unequal systematically. And that, I think the earlier investments can kind of counteract that in much more effective ways than thinking that just free college, when not recognizing that actually there is already a lot of redistribution that colleges do. They don't tell so that they can continue some of the fundraising. Like a lot of the resources that Berkeley gets is redistributed to provide the financing of low-income children, students. So it's long-winded, but I think those are the elements that come to mind that I think are very important.
Anyone agree with me that maybe his answer did provide justice to the question? Thank you very much, yes. Next question, right here. Microphone. Microphone is coming, yes. Adam, be patient.
My name is Alan. I'm a public policy student here at USC. And you mentioned that in order to have successful integration of schools, part of that step is recruiting and retaining more teachers of color. And so I know there's no North Stars, as you've said, but I wonder if you have strategies you've seen that have been successful at both recruiting and retaining more teachers of color.
Well, like one example is like people have often talked about, when we talk about curricular quality, like among schools that have heavy minority, like Black and Latino, heavily populated high schools, only a third of them offer calculus. Those are like gatekeepers to like STEM fields. If you want to be an engineer, like if you didn't do that, you're not actually in position. So the fact that 2% of Black freshmen who are Black major in engineering, like, you think they don't value education, or do you think that there's something about the opportunity structure that they haven't had the requisite access to some of those courses? Now, the reason that's relevant for mentoring, like I teach quantitative methods at UC Berkeley. One of the things that I see, and this is true in the STEM fields for women and young girls, that when you don't see people that look like you, even to become an economist, like it helped to have mentors that look like me, or at least were studying issues that pertain to racial inequality. It helped me envision, oh, so you could use those tools to tackle social justice, like not just, interest rate. No, interest rates could be good, but like that wasn't what got me into economics. So I think the point that I'm making about teacher diversity is it's very helpful to be exposed to women leaders before they run for president, to be exposed to leaders so that when there's a police sergeant and there's a search for the next police sergeant, they could be minority, they could be women, but you could see how their leadership could translate. When people haven't seen that, they don't really know what to make of it, right? So I think there's something about how we invoke the full dimensions of the possibilities to kids at a young age to say, you could be an aerospace engineer, you could be but if they never really see that, I think it kind of takes away the imaginative career processes. So the way I would say that relates to the diversity of teachers is that there have been systems that have shown that even among highly achieving third graders, that Black third graders are half as likely to be placed in gifted and talented programs with the same high test scores. And that when the teacher composition becomes more diverse, that's been one of the most significant ways in which the disproportionate placement in special education versus gifted programs versus college preparatory, like those tracking systems, they have been much more equitable in places that have embraced a more teacher diversity. And it's not because the Black teachers have always made the decisions, but there's a spillover effect of learning and taking away some of the blind spots that we all have if we haven't been exposed to diversity. So I think some of those implicit biases are system processes that teacher diversity and teacher training, professional development, I think plays a role. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, one more thing that's on that. So 1 in 5 teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years. And in high poverty, I don't know what it is in LAUSD, but in many urban high poverty areas, it's 1 in 2. Now, what that leads to is like children in high minority Hispanic schools are twice as likely to be taught by inexperienced teachers relative to experienced ones. And if you don't think that's translated into achievement deficits, like you're very mistaken. And I teach at Berkeley, but like everybody knows, don't look at my teaching file or my video recordings of that first year teaching. I was terrible. Okay, so I think you can be gifted as anyone in teaching, but you need to be mentored and you need to have some time to learn the craft. It's art and science, and there's an ability that is not just something you learn on day one. So I think those are elements that I think of as diverse teaching workforce, and it does require higher teacher salaries. Mm-hmm. And I think I've been impressed with housing affordability issues to promise something about the housing affordability to new teachers to defray some of those costs. I think it will cause many more teachers and more diverse backgrounds of teachers to enter and be retained in the teaching workforce. Okay, I promise I'll stop on that.
All right, very good. Next question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Megan. I currently work for LA Unified for a research unit that works for the board. I'm a former, I just graduated in May from USC, from the policy program.
All right.
So I have 2 questions. In my work, a question that we're interested in is how do we measure what data points, like in a district that's predominantly Black and Latino and low income, with policymakers that want to see schools more integrated in various ways? Like, how do we measure or illustrate integration or segregation? And another context is that there's been this growing interest in looking at where students enroll in schools throughout the district. So my first question is, like, what data points do you think could be used to help illustrate either the current state of segregation or the impact of various policies on trying to integrate.
So I think the one thing, this is not necessarily LAUSD focused, but I think it is important to understand that like 2/3 of school segregation today occurs between district, not within. Whereas the earlier era, most of the segregation actually occurred within district lines. And so that means busing, especially in a city like LA, is not a viable instrument. So that's why I really didn't like, even in the presidential debates, where the word desegregation or integration and busing were like used interchangeably. That's a hijacking of the entire mission. Busing was a tool, and the changing of integration to the word busing is really a political calculation on the part of those who are trying to resist, to say, let's just call this forced school choice. Let's call this busing, because nobody likes to be bused further away. And we don't want to be called racist by saying we resist integration. So let's just change the naming convention of these arguments, and now we just call it busing. No, we don't think busing is the solution, but we do think integration. Now, what's the difference? The difference is now housing policy and inclusive zoning ordinances and things that are causing many fewer mixed income neighborhoods would now be part of what would have to be reformed. People don't really want that part, so they like to say busing because they know that's not going to be a viable place or thing to do, like here in LA or here in places that, So I think part of it is that, doing integration in LA Unified doesn't have the same, impact because it's mostly low income, and it's, I don't know what the numbers are, but it might be 85% like minority, I don't know. But yeah, so maybe that's like not exactly the thing. But I think what I'm trying to kind of highlight is that the Milliken decision of 1974 ruled that it banned inter-district desegregation plans. And that was actually a pretty pivotal, Thurgood Marshall at the time said it was a death blow to the integration movement, because he was already anticipating that the middle class flight and the use of creating and seceding and redrawing district boundaries would be the next instrument and tool to segregate. And that's what we've seen where I'm like in the Bay Area, so Piedmont is a very wealthy community right inside of Oakland, but they just gerrymandered the school district boundaries. It's a liberal community. It's not like, we're not talking about a red, this is Democrat dominated, but they redraw the boundaries. It's like only really heavily affluent. It's almost 90% white. Marin County, there's various examples of the gerrymandering of school district boundaries, seceding of traditional public schools, and sometimes using charter schools as a vehicle to kind of avoid diversity. So I think those are real things that we have to be, the younger people would say woke, but we would have to be like vigilant, because these are not evoking riots or race riots, but they're no less segregative. The fact that it's an invisible boundary doesn't make it not having huge impacts on children's opportunity. So those are kind of related ideas.
Thank you. My second question goes to what you're talking about with STEM. And one finding we had in our research for what you said about access to STEM courses, but then we also looked at enrollment in STEM courses based on school demographics. And we found that in schools that were mostly minority students, the students in the upper level STEM classes were more white and Asian, but still mostly minority students. But in the schools that were more racially diverse, so more larger white and Asian populations, there's a much greater disparity between overall school enrollment and the enrollment in the upper level STEM courses. So I didn't know, it's kind of an open-ended question. Have you encountered that elsewhere? And if you could speak to what some of the causes you may think behind that?
So I think a myth that I think should be debunked is that minorities don't value education, and that's the primary source. My colleague David Kerp just published this New York Times op-ed like last week on part of this argument, and he did cite some of the work in the book, but he was talking about the kind of an intersectional approach or the synergies that could be produced through prenatal care and K-12, school resource equity and integration if we did them in concert. He was kind of making that argument. And we got, okay, I guess I can't say this. I forgot I'm on TV, not TV, but film. Okay, well anyways, the point is that we got some letters that I think we're making an argument that Black folk don't really value education, and that's like the reason, and that's why integration will continue to fail. This kind of culture of poverty argument that has a lot of salience in people's minds is actually, it's like the chicken or the egg. It's like if you don't give people an opportunity, and then all of a sudden in high school you start offering certain things that they're not prepared to take advantage of, yeah, they're not going to be successful in some of those advanced coursework. Because if you start that late, it doesn't actually work well. So I think the tracking part, the reason why I'm focusing on the elementary school years is because it provides the momentum for some of them to be effective by the middle and high school years. But if you try to do this only in the high school years without understanding the continuum of opportunity that precedes it, yeah, it won't be successful. But when you don't see it, the incorrect presumption is not that these children and their families don't value education. I think like that's a misnomer. And if you talk to these families, if you go in, I would tell you, and the book really helps illustrate that, the kind of sacrifices that minority families, particularly Black families, have made to secure education. I'm talking about being firebombed. I'm talking about like things that the older generation like endured just for the promise of education for their children. That doesn't sound to me like a culture or a group of people who don't value education. So I just think that that narrative is a popular one, but it's not one that's rooted in the evidence.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm an MPP student here. I was recently reading about Al Roth and the use of placement algorithms that are becoming more popular in schools. I'm wondering if, I know they have carve-outs for like local community, like siblings that go to schools and stuff like that. Are there opportunities to harness these sort of technocratic algorithms to encourage integration? Or do you think the fact that they're still ultimately based on choice is going to make it difficult?
Yeah, I think there can be some good, what I call controlled choice. So I think not giving parents any choice, I don't think that that's a viable way forward. But there's a balance between complete unrestricted choice that basically exercises choice that requires parental wealth to be realized. It's like what we really call school choice is really, if you have wealth, you can exercise the choice. And we're going to sell opportunity on the market, and you will buy it via your housing costs. And we're going to call it like a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom, but what we're really going to show you is the school quality index, and we're going to show you that on either side of this boundary, the housing prices are going to be 2.4 times greater on either side of the boundary, even though the house is exactly the same. Like, that's what's happening. It's people buying the chances of upward mobility for their children through houses, not actually the building and the structure of the house. And we're using the market to ration access to school quality. That's what's happening now, and we call it school choice. I'm just saying, let's kind of be real that yes, many people in this room are middle class. When we have opportunities, we have the opportunity to move if we don't like our local school system. Our kids are in Oakland Public Unified. They like it, but we moved to a public school community that we could believe in. But you can imagine that low income, less wealthy parents don't have that flexibility. And the question is whether the charter school movement is helping choice or destabilizing the finances of traditional public schools. I think we need to revisit such a question, because I think there's some unintended consequences of the proliferation of charter schools without quality necessarily always being expanded. I don't always know if I'm staying on track with the original question, so you have to reel me in. But those were my initial thoughts when you raised the question, so let me stop there.
Thank you.
I'll stand up because I'm a little hidden here. My name is Hannah, and I'm a public administration student here at USC. I have a question about the concept you raised about recruiting and retaining new teachers, particularly teachers of color, by in urban areas subsidizing housing. I lived in Oakland, and I had friends who were lots of teachers who could no longer be teachers because they couldn't afford the housing. So I'm curious as to whether there are examples of using that. If there are no examples, how can we encourage districts to consider that, and kind of what we can do in the political realm to help encourage support for that?
I do know that I just read recently about a new initiative in a urban city that is trying this out, or at least made a proposal to pursue it. But right now I'm blanking on the city. It is a large urban city. I don't know that there's one that have done this yet. But I do know in places like the Bay Area, LA, New York City, these really high cost of living, in particular where housing affordability are at a crisis level, that I think is actually even more important than the teacher salary in attracting a more diverse teaching workforce. But I can't remember off the top of my head. But I do think that there's some grassroots movement. And this is where like the synergy between housing policy community that's trying to tackle how do we deal with this housing shortage? I mean, housing availability issue. And then the public school communities are like, we have the shortage of teachers. And if you look in the middle, like they're facing for the same reason. And so I think that's why, you know, we can't lose sight of the racial wealth disparities and in this country that certainly play a role.
I don't know if it's improper form, but I can reference some work that the Price Center for Social Innovation did last year with the LA Business Council Institute on this issue of workforce housing and what was happening to people who were making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, and the documented fact that people are moving further away. And LAUSD actually has this very small pilot program where they actually took some of their land and actually worked with developers to build housing. It turned out that at least in this initial pilot that it wasn't a good a fit for the teachers than they had anticipated because of perhaps where it was located and different things, but it was really important for the support staff of the schools. And they were the ones that took advantage of it. However, you know, we actually looked around different cities around these, not just looking at teachers, but broader programs as well. And, you know, they're just so small scale. And that maybe some of the models that are beginning to work are the kinds of things where, you know, that public sector is leasing land, long-term leases to developers in building inclusive property structures. You mentioned inclusive zoning, but you can do that at the outfront. So there's a little bit of it. But what we found in surveying employers and so forth is just that it's not even on their mental radar. You know, they're struggling with the budgets they have. And so to imagine subsidizing the workforce with housing in one way or another, it's out of that budget. So then if it's out of that budget, how do you, as you were talking about earlier, coordinate systems that reinforce and also come at odds with each other? Yeah, absolutely.
I agree. I had a question. I think I saw you.
Sorry, I got carried away. Hi, my name's Jacqueline Johnson. I told him you were my cousin, but I work for Alexandria House. I do advocacy for policy and innovation. And one of the questions I have is because I work with students who are a part of the homeless and abuse system, and the charter schools are my concern because I just wanted to know, is there a reason why you would put a charter school in a neighborhood that, I guess my question is, would it be more cost effective to revamp that school in the neighborhood and have the dollars and the resources go into that neighborhood instead of taking a charter school to another area and giving them that opportunity. I don't understand why, if there's a school that's being completely ignored and, closed down, that you couldn't put a charter school in that neighborhood, because when something goes wrong in our houses, we don't move, we try to fix it. But something's going wrong with our children in our neighborhood, so we move them instead of fixing the problem that exists there.
Yeah. I think I want to just let that live and breathe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Just amen. I don't have much to add, but I hear you.
Question back up front. That's okay. That's okay. We still have about 15, 20 minutes. So
I really appreciate this. So, and to just piggyback on a lot of points that were made already. One, I really would like to hear from your research, the wage disparity. I mean, it makes no sense for a community that's right down the street, 15 minutes if you get caught by all the lights from SpaceX, and still not have children in educational institutions being developed for those types of jobs, those types of engineering jobs that are available. So are there any interventions that you have seen in terms of not just pedagogy, but curriculum that may turn around or enhance a community's ability to kind of self-sustain itself, like cooperative models, things of that nature? That's one. And two, have you looked into the local control funding formula versus other funding formulas in other states, and seeing how, whether or not that's just a raggedy formula, plain and simple, and then especially towards our special needs children? And then lastly, how can I get an autographed copy of your book?
All right, well, let's take that last one. I love giving autographed copies of books. No, just kidding. But yeah, of course, I would love to sign. I think we may be out of them, but I can certainly give you a link to how you can get that, but I'd be happy to sign a book. But I think that you're a very important point, that one of the things that I think is promising that came out of the Great Recession is that it put a much greater awareness that the home foreclosure crisis and the impacts and the intensity of that was felt most heavily in places where housing affordability issues were the greatest. And so LA Unified, the San Francisco Bay Area, they hemorrhaged great numbers of teacher layoffs as a result. And even though that was bad and painful, and it did negatively affect student achievement, one of the things that grew out of that intense need was the legislature passing an $18 billion 10-year commitment that was part of the local control funding formula. And it changed our state system. Prop 13 has certainly affected many things in kind of negative ways, but certainly the local control funding formula changes and investments in schools that included greater state pre-K investments have been a significant silver lining that has actually, we document one of our first studies of the impacts of local control funding formulas showing that the progressive funding formula used is actually one of the most progressive funding formulas in the country now. We had gone from kind of lackluster, middle of the road, to one of the most progressive funding formulas. And the impacts, if you sustain them, we found, like, if you sustain or are exposed to the increases in per pupil spending for 4 consecutive years, we see significant increases in high school graduation rates, narrowing of achievement gaps between poor and non-poor children that are on par with like 7 months of learning for like 3 to 4 years of this increase in spending. So it's not something that happens immediately overnight, but those are things that are happening in positive ways. I think what we have to be aware of is that the whole language of local control means that we have to make sure there's accountability structures to ensure that how the resources are being used within the district remain to be done in equitable ways. That the reason why we typically have been I think, more reserved in having more local autonomy is because historically local autonomy meant less equity. It meant that you listen more to the voices in the district that have more money, have more political power, and that typically sometimes undermined equity gains. So there's questions about whether we have the sufficient safeguards where local control has the benefit of tailoring school communities to their local needs in ways that district or state officials can't know and can't appreciate. So that's what the power of local funding and autonomy can deliver. But you have to have that kind of awareness that to recognize that the downside, if you're not vigilant, is how the decisions get made within the district that are sometimes more opaque can sometimes be allocated in less equitable ways without accountability structures. Yes, so those are important, but I would say the LCFF, you should think of those as positive. The data and evidence are showing that that's having a significant impact. The money is narrowing gaps, and that is a significant piece of the puzzle. It's insufficient by itself, but it's a very significant piece to be continued. I would say the one cautionary note is in the last year, a significant share is going toward teacher pension debt. So the state of California accumulated a lot of pension debt, so a lot of the new money is actually not making it to the classroom. And I just make that point because you still have to follow the money. Because when we say money didn't matter, it's not always because the money doesn't matter. It's sometimes because it actually went toward building a new building, and new buildings can be good. Like we're in this beautiful, I get new buildings, but what I'm saying is they don't close math scores the next year. They don't close reading gaps. So if they're going to the pension debt, it is important for teachers, but it's not something that's closing instructional expenditure pieces. And so while there's a lot of emphasis on budget deficits, it's really the deficits of opportunity that have to be part of our focus. So those are the things that occur to me. Again, you ask questions that require more than but those are the things that, and we have evidence in the book on the impacts of LCFF to date in these first 5 years of the program with my former PhD student, Sean Tanner.
So my kids went to the school that's right across the street from USC here.
Great.
And the time they were there, everyone got free lunch because 90% of the kids qualified.
Yep.
And they were, for a long time, the only white kids in the school. My neighborhood now has lots of white people in it. And
gentrification, yes?
There's a lot of gentrification. And on my ride to school, I see all the benches that say gentrification sucks. And then we see all the homeless encampments, all the devastation that housing prices are bringing. But what I wonder is there a moment of opportunity as resourced people with education, people with tech skills are moving back to the city? Is there a moment where with the right policies, schools could be integrated and they could be mixed, not just racially, but socioeconomically? Could that school across the street look different in 10 years if we had the right set of policies in place?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because that is an opportunity presented before us, that in cities like New York, in the Bay Area, in LA, the gentrification does have some potential unintended consequences if we don't adjoin how the rent and part of the rental markets are used to ensure that the displacement is not driving out too many of the lower income, more vulnerable families. Because obviously the work on homelessness and involuntary evictions and is a real phenomenon that needs more attention. But I will say that if we're able to do some safeguards around those vulnerable families, the gentrification and influx of more middle class and upper middle class families to those communities that are giving public schools a shot again, I think if we can kind of cultivate that trust, I think there could be some significant benefits from that, especially if you're able to help reinvoke the public mission of schools and that we can all own part of its success. So I do think there's potential, but I'm also recognizing that right now we have a culture of what's become noble is just pursuing exclusively what's best for your kid and only focusing on only that. And that's celebrated, that's thought of as like you're doing everything right. And I think there's like something about thinking about creating a system where there's no shortage of people that want the best for their kids. What there's a shortage of is people wanting to create systems that create schools that are best for all kids. And I think there's a way to do that, but it's not through Princeton for Mine.
Good evening, and thanks for being here. I'm Angela Johnson-Peters. I'm an alumni of the SoCal cohort. The question I have is, I work with an organization that has a in-school program for Black and brown boys in high school, and we're also now in middle schools. So I'm really intrigued with this notion of that we have to start earlier. And so there are these initiatives that LAUSD is doing, just try to get, as many community partners to work with schools, and yet the bureaucracy is like mind-boggling. I'm curious about your thoughts in terms of studies between the difference of impact with working with younger students vis-a-vis high school and then college, because we also look at college access too. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that the returns to the investments, while they take a lot more longer to yield and manifest, with the early investments, they take longer to actually see the full impact. But in terms of their total impact, the early investments, given our current dollars and how they're currently spent, the marginal effects, the biggest impact is happening through the earlier investments. And there's kind of like a decay that happens if you wait longer and longer. And part of it is the cumulative nature of learning, that early learning begets future learning, and that the neuroscience literature and work on the science of brain development, even showing that our brains develop 1 million new neural connections every second in the first 3 years of life, and how sensitive our formation of that is to early life stressors and poverty and lack of resources and nurturing interpersonal relationships. So I think when we have a safety net, thank you, that is having young mothers work more and more hours, but we don't have like an investment stream where we think of preschool as not childcare or babysitting. It's not really valuing the children and the human of the capital. There's human capital, and then there's the human part of the word human capital. And we have to kind of get at the human. As part of an economist, there's a view that we focus on statistics and that we see capital, but not the human side. We want to get behind the statistics and realize these are children's lives being affected. So we need to stop because everybody needs to go home. But I really want to thank everybody for being here and engaging us in this conversation. I want to thank Gary for having me, and I'm very appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Do you have a few minutes as people might come up and mill around before? Okay, I want to make sure you can catch your flight home so you can be with your kids tonight as well.
Fair enough.
Thanks again for everyone for being here and joining us, and we'll have many more events in the spring, and we hope to see you there as well.
Great.
All right, take care.